Welcome back. Today I want to talk about a topic that's been on my mind all week, and I'm not really here to answer any questions. I'm here more to raise questions that I've had in my mind and maybe start a discussion, and feel free to contribute in the comments, and let's get a discussion going. If you like this episode, or if you like this channel in general, then please subscribe, please tell your friends. It's always great to have more people in a community discussing things around literature. And so the topic of today that got me thinking is really, what is a novel, and what qualifies as a novel? And I asked this because last week I reviewed on my Instagram channel a French book called Le Mage du Kremlin, which translates in English as The Wizard of the Kremlin. And it's considered a novel, even though to me, what I said in my review last week is that, yeah, it's a novel, but really a very thinly disguised piece of nonfiction, a piece of feature journalism that is given a few tweaks in order to feature some attributes that might qualify it as a novel. And it just got me thinking, why would the author do this exactly? What value did it add for the author and ultimately for the reader to present this in the form of a novel? And the other book that prompted that question, which I read recently, was another French novel, quote unquote novel, called Vivrevit, Living Fast, by Brigitte Giraud, which won the very prestigious literary prize in France called the Prix Goncourt, which is a prize that rewards the best novel in France. And except everything was fine, it was a good book, had a few flaws, but it was a decent book. But again, it wasn't really a novel, it was a memoir. It was the memoir of a lady reminiscing about the death of her husband in a motorcycle accident. And it seemed to me so strange that this would qualify as a novel, because there were no fictional characters. This was a true story. There was very little elaboration to the novel. So all of these books got me thinking, and I started to detect a trend, that this wasn't the first time that this had been happening. I've seen it more and more. Another book that I read last year, which I really didn't like, precisely because of this unnecessary formatting into a novel, was a book called The Magician by Colm Tóibín, the Irish writer. And it was essentially a biography of the German writer Thomas Mann in the form of a novel. And I wondered at the time when I reviewed it, what value did it add for this to be in a novel? In fact, I felt at the time that novelizing this biography took something out of took something out. And so I guess that's maybe the first point of entry into this question. What did it take out to have a novel? For me, specifically with this biography of Thomas Mann, it took out a point of view and an opinion of the author on the subject that he was covering. There was sort of an impartiality that was automatic. If you're novelizing, the author steps back. Even if there's a narrator in there, the author steps back, and so there's no real point of view, no real transmission. It's a free-flowing machine that takes a life of its own. And again, I'm not sure what that life provides in terms of additional value to the reader when dealing with a biography. I think in the case of the French book Vivrevit, somebody might argue, well, it has a starting point. it has an endpoint, and the characters, namely the author, who is also the narrator, and her husband go through certain arcs. Their arcs have different emotional levels. The husband's arc, this is not a spoiler, ends in tragedy as he dies in a motorcycle accident. And so that's fine. There is that plot of sorts. It's a difference from, let's say, a business book about the top 10 strategies on how to win at business, where you maybe have 10 chapters and each chapter would represent a strategy, and there's no real movement or momentum, more of a dry analysis. Is that the definition of a novel? Is that there needs to be some forward movement? That forward movement presumably needs to create some sort of tension. There presumably needs to be something at stake for the people in the novel, and that may be a protagonist and an antagonist. And fine, again, I think I understand where a book like The Wizard of the Kremlin can come from. There is a tension between certain characters which propels the story forward. That's fine. But ultimately, despite all of this, despite these arcs, despite this tension, and tension that of course creates a certain level of emotion in characters and in the reader, one of the fundamental qualifying attributes, I think, of a novel is that there needs to be somewhere a certain amount of invention and a certain amount of distance from reality. Maybe distance isn't the right word, but certainly invention. Now that level of invention can be more or less distant from reality. I mean, one can imagine that authors get inspired by real life characters and events all the time. And so you just change a name a little bit, but it's still ultimately a bit of a true story. But when the events and characters are identical to reality, it seems a little bit difficult to rely purely on the tension and the arcs to qualify as a novel. And there I have a little bit of trouble understanding how these books qualify as novels. One author who I think has been very successful at blurring that line is, again, a French author whose name is Emmanuel Carrère, who specialized in telling his story and blending it with other elements of nonfiction and or fiction in a way that the stories propel and move forward in ways that some might be true and other elements might not be true. So I think in French literature, and this is maybe a trend that we're seeing in France, but increasingly in other places, I think he's sort of one of the original thinkers of that. I'm probably wrong, and I'd love to hear from any of you if you know of other writers who have been quite so powerful in recent years in this blurring of fact and fiction. If I just step back for a moment and think, okay, well, if I compare it to TV or cinema, like take a series like The Crown on Netflix, which is about the British royal family. That is a drama if we extended the analogy into books, it would be considered a novel. Some of it is absolutely true. Some of it is inspired by reality, and that inspiration and that liberty with the truth is injected to help drive the story, fill in blanks where we might not be 100% sure what exactly happened, and so on. And so there's a certain amount of emotional attachment to some of the characters through the situations they face, versus a very dry documentary, which might use very factual sources, very factual images, very factual interviews with people who have known these things. And so that might be a good way to look at it, that yes, the Crown is quote unquote a biography of this family, but it is dramatized and fictionalized and novelized. And where might the additional value be in that relative to a straightforward documentary? That's something that you might want to ponder. I don't necessarily have the answer to that, aside from perhaps using the word emotion and connection to characters. I think this, again, the blurring and the experimentation of fact and fiction and novelization has many fathers. I mentioned one called Emmanuel Carrère. I think he's probably got inspirations of his own in the past. And those might probably include authors who were quite well known for writing metafiction. So metafiction is where the author might inject themselves into the story and thus bring the novel into our plane of reality, the reader's plane of reality, and so be brought back into the real world. Books that might self-refer to themselves, that's a form of metafiction that might take the book out of a purely fictional context and into a more real context. So for example, off the top of my head, somebody like John Fowles was a great pioneer of metafiction, but there are so many others. The list is extremely long. Another angle of origin for this genre of novelized realities, let's say, would be the whole new journalism segment of literature, which was pioneered in the mid-60s by writers like Tom Wolfe, Hunter S. Thompson, Jon Didion, and these were people who wrote short journalistic segments, short relative to novels, but long relative to newspaper articles, long journalistic segments in which they investigated a real life subject, but injected themselves into the story and made it a real story. Again, used the idea of an arc, of going from point A to point B, and showcasing how that arc affected them as a narrator or characters, real people that they were writing about. And so Jon Didion, notoriously in her collection Slouching Towards Bethlehem, does a lot of that. She moves to San Francisco and she writes about that experience, but it's really a story of the different people she meets and how she's living in California and so on. So those are some of the origins of novels not being novels. If you want to go back even earlier than that, you might look at something like In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I've never read In Cold Blood, but it is a story that Truman Capote covered in a journalistic way of a true life event of a gruesome murder in Kansas, where he looks at this event, this gruesome murder, and the accused and their lives. Again, I haven't read it, so I'm not quite sure how it develops throughout the book, but it's certainly a book that took a nonfiction event and injected a certain amount of excitement into it. So is that the answer? Is that the end of the question? Is excitement the word we're looking for here that defines, well, that's a nonfiction book and that's a novel because it has some excitement. And that excitement is built out of, again, going from point A to point B and seeing evolution of characters and their emotions, and that's what creates a certain amount of excitement. And so sometimes some nonfiction books might not benefit from excitement. I mean, I think of the best biography that I can think of, which is the books on Lyndon Johnson by Robert Caro. Those books are nonfiction, they're biographies, and yet they are written in such a way that really drives the story and makes it fascinating, but factual. It's heavily researched, and the quality of the research and the analysis is unprecedented and unlikely to ever be replicated again. It's that deep. But the excitement is there, and yet nobody would qualify that as a novel. And it's incredibly exciting. So I've just contradicted myself in a way, because it's not a novel, but it's incredibly exciting, and the story does go in an amazing way. And you feel the emotions of Lyndon Johnson as he progresses through his career, emotions of fear or anger or jealousy, and those are what drives this extremely complex character through his life story, ultimately towards greater heights of power and towards the presidency. So, lots of confusing things here. And so I might conclude this total rant and these unanswered questions by coming back to the original problem that I had in the last few books that I read, these French books, who looked like nonfiction memoirs or biographies or analyses, and yet were qualified as novels. I just have trouble understanding really why that is, when especially in terms of the book Vivrevit, Living Fast, the story of the woman losing her husband, there really was 0 degree of invention. None of the characters were renamed, or none of the facts or events were altered. This was really a strict retelling and very methodical retelling of her husband's death, a tragic death in a motorcycle accident. Whereas the other French book, Le Mage du Kremlin, The Wizard of the Kremlin, which is a thinly disguised biography of Vladimir Putin and one of his key advisors, yes, it's a little bit embellished in a way that was so vulgar that it's like, why are you bothering to embellish it? This could have just been a straight up nonfiction geopolitical analysis, and it would have been great. But instead, there seemed to be the need for this framing device that launched it into a novel, which I absolutely didn't get. So that's all I have in terms of my questions around a novel. What makes a novel a novel? What makes a book not a novel? What are your thoughts on that? What do you think might be some of the rules that apply to that? I think it's an interesting question. Do you think this is a trend that might be progressing going forward? I happen to think that it is. I think a lot more people are going to be writing these nonfiction books and presenting them as novels, and I worry a little bit about that, because I think that will lessen the muscle of invention that we expect from authors, and especially novelists. But in any case, I'd love to hear your suggestions. If you've enjoyed this episode, stay tuned. I'm going to try and have some episodes up every week on this channel, so you may want to subscribe and tell your friends. I'd love to hear from any of you. I try to respond to all comments as quickly as possible. It'd be great to hear from anyone, and in the meantime, keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.